Welcome to the Bekaert Tax Beat, a conversation about tax that matters.
Welcome to this edition of the Bekaert Tax Beat. Today is June 11th, 2021, and our main topic of discussion today will be Green Book Part 2, focusing on a legislative update and the business and energy incentives. But first, let's introduce my colleagues joining us on today's podcast. Sarah.
Hello, this is Sarah McGregor in the Greenville, South Carolina.
Ron.
Hello, this is Ron Wainwright, hailing from Raleigh, North Carolina.
And I'm Brooks Nelson. I'm sitting in downtown Richmond, Virginia. All right, Sarah McGregor, how's life treating you?
It is good to be a tax nerd. There's lots of things happening. You can be right without being correct because everything is just speculation. It's pretty exciting. We have our interns here with us for the summer. And it's always great to have new, fresh folks in the office and people that are just discovering this profession, and that's always exciting.
Awesome. All righty, so let's back up and set the table on the Green Book. So we did an earlier podcast on Green Book Part 1, and the main topics in that were the income tax rate plays, both for business and for individuals, with a little side dialogue on estate and gift. As I said, today we're going to be mainly focusing on a legislative update where we are in the process, and then we're going to look to the good news of business and energy incentives. But let's back up and let me set the table again. On March 31, the White House released the American Jobs Plan, or what they called a fact sheet for the American Jobs Plan. And that was focused mainly on the corporate tax rate and the business incentive pieces of the overall plan. On April 28th, about a month later, the White House released a fact sheet on the American Families Plan, and that one focused primarily on the individual tax rates and the estate and gift types issues going on. Again, those are just broadly speaking. All right, then on May 28th, President Biden proposed a federal budget that encompasses concepts from both of these prior two plans. In conjunction with the release of the budget, the Treasury released what is called the General Explanations of the Administration's Fiscal Year 2022 Revenue Proposals. Nobody calls it that. They call it the Green Book. It's over 100 pages in a PDF format. Again, I will repeat, I think this was very well written. That in particular, the American Families Plan was very unclear on numerous things that they were talking about. This gives us a lot of insight and details, I think, in a pretty clear-cut manner of what they're talking about. And in this Green Book, it is scored as a 2.4 trillion net revenue raiser. All right, so again, we're going to talk about the legislative updates and the business and energy incentives on this podcast. We're not going to talk about the corporate and individual tax rate proposals again. We're not going to talk in depth about the international tax. We're not going to talk about the IRS investment and compliance and infrastructure. We're not talking about all the other infrastructure investments. So while we may brush on these in some of the conversation, that is not the focus today. So I think that's enough of a tee up. So let's start with our illustrious guest, Mr. Ron Wainwright, and talk to us about where we stand in all this process and what does it mean?
So Brooks, thank you. What does it mean and where do we stand is really an interesting question. As Brooks correctly highlighted, we've seen a number of pronouncements, most recently the Green Book, which really is the fiscal year 22 budget analysis. And within that, it takes into consideration the Americans Jobs Plan and the Americans Family Plan. The reality is, until we really see legislative language, we're still, I would say, in somewhat of a query as to what will pass, what will not pass. As I've always said, it's very important to look at the timetable that the House and the Senate are working on, and what are the priorities from the White House. And so just an update from really late last night is a bipartisan group of Democrat and Republicans on the Senate side did in fact reach an agreement on what is referred to, which is a priority for the White House, which is called the infrastructure plan. That was originally a plan that is tangled up in AJP and AFP that President Biden put out that really called for upwards of $2.3 trillion around the infrastructure of the United States. He subsequently actually did pare it back to about $1.7 trillion during talks with a Republican senator. So when you think about, I'll say, the infrastructure plan, and then that'll lead me into the timetable, they did in fact reach a deal which they called a realistic compromise on how to modernize the infrastructure and energy technologies in the United States. Interestingly enough, it does not include tax increases, at least based on the reconciliation that they reached in a bipartisan manner. The challenge that they have, along with other groups that are working in kind of across the aisle, is that ultimately there are only a very few number of days left when you really think about the horizon of what we see coming. So as an example, from the Memorial Day holiday to actually when they recess, there's actually 15 days in the House and 17 in the Senate. And of course, we've burned some of those days being on June 11th. They actually go on recess from the 4th of July to ultimately August. And so then when you look across the aisle, so to speak, and you look at the August recess, there's really only 58 days in the House and 69 days in the Senate. And we're talking about tax, or what is the legislative update from a tax perspective. Remember that they have a number of other key dates in there. As an example, we know the Paycheck Protection Program expires June 30th. We know that August 1st is the end to the debt limit suspension. We recognize that the country's on a fiscal year of September 30th, so the government needs to be funded to avoid shutdown. And then entangled in all that is potentially tax legislation. What I would comment to you in looking over the horizon and what most people expect right now is, at least as of today, the administration is prioritized crafting a bipartisan infrastructure bill. And the original expectation, as announced by Speaker Pelosi, was to have a bill on the House that got voted out of the House prior to the July 4th recess. But remember, the days left are 58 in the House and 69 in the Senate, with a lot of legislation above and beyond tax. The general view right now is that we will likely see one large combined tax bill. It will likely be passed under budget reconciliation, and it is likely to be enacted around the October 21 timetable. And as you can expect, with the number of days left, there's some contraction occurring from that standpoint. I think the biggest challenge that we're going to see, obviously we know that the Democrats control the House. Technically, depending on how a piece of legislation is passed, they need 51 votes in the Senate. But I think the White House has already faced some significant backlash from what are referred to as the progressive Democrats, who in fact do not want the president to abandon the Democratic priorities of how he came into the White House. So you have this progressive and moderate question occurring from a political perspective. Senator Joe Manchin, who has been visibly outspoken, has actually insisted, and you've seen him come out on a number of pieces, and remember, he's a Democrat out of West Virginia. He wants to pass a piece of tax legislation with support from both parties. So therefore, he could hold up a Democratic proposal candidly on his own. But I would say he was part of the group that has reached some type of a resolution. Meanwhile, you also have a group out there which is called the Bipartisan House Problem Solvers Caucus, which has released its own infrastructure plan this week, and that proposal would cost about 1.5 trillion, which includes about 762 billion in new spending. So I think Sarah said it absolutely correctly, is that a lot has to happen. And we are only speculating at this point in time, but I would tell you the general view from the Hill and all of our connections is that we're likely to see, given what is at face from a legislative perspective, that it'll collapse into one combined tax bill passed under budget reconciliation and probably enacted around October 21st. And Sarah, I know you've got good insight as well. So what are your thoughts?
Well, it sounds like, Ron, that we're sensing some coming together on an infrastructure, that folks are in agreement on that we do need to spend and get some things happening to improve the country's infrastructure. The extent of it, the amount of the expense certainly is still open to discussion, but I think there's less coalescing around the tax rate increases to pay for it. And I think that's where there's going to be some difficulty. So I appreciate that there are some bipartisan agreements coming together and some discussions and negotiating on the infrastructure side, but the pay for side has got to be just as well attacked, I think. And I'm not seeing a lot of movement in that area right now.
Yes, President Biden very much wants a compromise. It's something that he promised, or what I feel like was part of his promise to become a president. However, he also seems, to like very much the theory behind some of these rate increases. And I think even though he signaled the willingness to walk away from the 28% corporate rate, and now it sounds like, some willingness last night to abandon, at least in this first pass, the rates. I don't think we can just discount and say this is all going away. I mean, he's also come back and said he wants to get this big deal passed, and he's going to go back and go look at these things, on piecemeal, maybe. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Ron? You get this big package pass, and then you do an end run and go back after it.
Well, I think you're correct. I mean, we cannot, as Sarah correctly said, and you did as well, we cannot overlook the fact that there must be, revenue raisers. What will be compromised and how much will need to be raised is really the question when you think about the provisions in certainly the budget, which was a combination of the AJP and the AFP. Infrastructure seems to be an area that they can rally around, which is in the best interest of the country when we think about our bridges, our roads, and some of the other areas that have been identified. There's a lot of moving pieces. As I referred to it, it's almost a jigsaw puzzle without really knowing what the picture looks like. What's working against them, as I mentioned, is the number of days they have. I do think one indicator is that it was interesting that the G7 meeting, which President Biden is attending today, there was an agreement reached for in essence, a global minimum tax rate of 15%. Now, of course, the G20 summit is coming up, which we'll participate, and it'll be interesting to see. Now, they agreed in concept around 15%. There's a lot of detail in what that means. But I think you see some very early steps of recognition of partisanship is always the best way to go for a couple different reasons. And certainly I think, Manchin has said that and indicated that, and is very a strong voice, obviously, from West Virginia in that.
Well, having the G7 agree on that sounds fantastic, and it would be a beautiful world if everybody did buy off on that, but they're not the countries that need to buy off on the 15%. It's the other guys trying to get the business away from the G7. So we'll see how far that one goes.
Agreed.
Yeah. Were you going to say something, Sarah?
I was going to say, we'll know better how the G20 responds to it. because those 20 countries encompass probably 75 to 80% of the world's GDP. So they'll cover a lot of ground if all 20 of those companies or the other 13 can come on board in the same kind of approach. But that's only part of the equation. That sort of sets the bottom floor for tax rate, but you still have to decide how much income by country is taxed to that country. And that's part of some other discussions that have been going on too. So much like the same way we have to deal with transactions in the states, how much income is taxed in state one versus state two when a company is operating in both. They have their own tax rates, and it's very similar to what's happening abroad now across countries. So at least a lot of the U.S. companies have been dealing with this idea of nexus and apportioning and allocating income. And then it's just a matter of figuring out the rates that are there.
Right. All right. So I think we can kind of move on from the legislative process piece and get to the second part of this podcast. I want to talk about the various business and energy incentives, and a lot of, on surface, some good news, some exciting stuff in there. When this neighborhood homes investment tax credit got introduced at first, there was kind of debate because it came out with very little detail, really. And there's debate: is this just a glorified low-income housing tax credit, or is it a low-income house tax credit on steroids, or is it a separate regime? So after looking at this, where, in your opinion, do you think it is on that spectrum?
I think it is the latter. I think it is a new regime, but it's also working in tandem with the low-income housing tax credit. And I think it's a new regime in the context that one of the key points in at least the Green Book is the principles of how they would be determining the amount of the credit. And these are new principles that are not contained in the current LIHTC or low-income housing tax credit. So you've got necessity, which one could argue is somewhat of a subjective determination. You have what's called limited subsidy. You have what they call skin in the game, which I very much appreciate. And then you have what they call no cliffs, which means there's no point at which an additional dollar of sales proceeds precipitously reduces the credit to zero. So it is a new regime due to how the Green Book has defined it. It is very broad, and it is computed, or the credit's computed, at what's called the development costs less the sales price in regards to the homeowner's rehabilitation. But this was a strong policy within the American Family Plan that President Biden clearly has identified as a high priority. So it's a new regime, and I think it's a steroid shot into LIHTC.
All right. Thank you. All right. So, Sarah, why don't you give some comments, your thoughts on the new markets tax credit provisions?
Absolutely. It's good news for new markets tax credit. The new market tax credit was set to expire, and this proposal would make it permanent and continue to fund it at the $5 billion threshold level, which is where the spending and funding for it grew to in 2020. Prior to that, it was limited to $3.5 billion per year, and now it's grown to $5 billion. It has been a very effective tool, the new markets tax credit, for investing in low-income communities, providing grocery stores in the middle of a food desert, providing jobs in locations close to or in the midst of qualifying areas with low-income neighborhoods. So very effective tool to put businesses, activity in areas that are targeted for needed growth and wages. And so we're pretty excited, and our own colleagues who work in this area are thrilled to see it continuing to grow like it is.
Amen. All right.
Brooks, if I may, I think that's another example in regards to the priority from President Biden. So when you think about LIHTC, when you think about the new market tax credit, and then obviously the new regime, as we just discussed, around neighborhood home investment tax credits, I think it sends a very strong message that this is a high priority and is likely one that, depending on the jigsaw puzzle and the picture that gets painted by it, I think these provisions will, in some form, become effective January 1, 2022.
Great. All right, so let's just flip over to energy. I mean, energy sustainability, it's got to be part of the path in the, to the future, regardless of administration or who's going to be the president for years to come. This is just this is a topic that will have to be tackled. A lot of a whole lot of provisions in here regarding energy. But Ron, why don't you pick what you consider 2 or 3 of the highlights out of the energy provisions here and talk about those for a sec.
Thank you. So you are correct, Brooks. I mean, when you kind of look through the fiscal year 22 budget and in the Green Book, I mean, there's actually 13 major provisions that deal with prioritizing clean energy. As you correctly say, we don't have necessarily time to talk about all of them, but I think the big 3, as I've referred to them, are one, the extending and actually enhancing renewable and alternative energy incentives. I think the establishment of this new tax credit for what's referred to as qualified advanced energy manufacturing is certainly a recognition of the manufacturing importance in our country, as well as kind of carbon considerations. And then you see a third key provision in extending and enhancing what are deemed to be energy tax efficiency and electrification incentives. And as we know, part of the infrastructure bill is actually to put electrical charging stations throughout our country as part of the infrastructure. So, if we can take those in order, I'll just kind of outline to you what I see and what I believe is forthcoming from the prioritization of clean energy. Again, 13 provisions that all are equally important, but what I call the big 3. So let's make a point to start with the first one, which is really extending and enhancing renewable and alternative energy incentives. So we know we're moving into what is often being considered to be a green economy, a less or more energy efficient. So what's the proposal? The proposal would extend the credits for investments in solar and geothermal electrical energy property. More qualified fuel cell power plants, more geothermal heat pumps, small wind property, offshore wind property, waste energy recovery property, and combined heat and power property. So the proposal would extend the full production tax credit for qualified facilities, really commencing construction after December 2021 and going through 2027, and then starting in 27, the credit rate actually does begin to phase down over a period of 5 years. Interestingly enough, in this proposal, and why I selected it out of the 13, is taxpayers actually would have an option to elect a cash payment in lieu of business tax credits, i.e. a direct pay option. Kind of moving on to the second one that I selected was really the continued, or really the establishment of a new tax credit for qualifying advanced energy manufacturing. So we do have right now a provision where the Department of Treasury awarded about $2.3 billion in tax credit under what's called 48 Cap C, which was to promote investment and job creation in clean energy manufacturing. The reason for the change, candidly, was domestic manufacturing of clean energy property, which we know is a critical component and a prioritization for the country as a whole, containing the infrastructure plan as well, is building clean and equitable economy, not reliant, so to speak, on oil. And so that $2.3 billion cap currently, which was allocated by the Department of Treasury, was unfortunately less than a third of the technically acceptable applications that were received by the Department of Treasury. So, actually applicants in the country applied for more than $8 billion of 48 Cap C credit. So, as I said, it's kind of the establishment and continuation of a new credit. So, well, what's the proposal? It would in essence modify and expand the current advanced energy manufacturing. It would expand the definition of qualifying energy products or projects that would be revised really to include industrial facilities, recycling in additions to production, expand eligible technologies, but certainly not limited to energy storage components, a little electrical grid modernization equipment. We know our electrical grid's now 60 plus years old. Carbon oxide sequestration and energy conservation technologies. And so this actually would propose to my $8 billion of applications, it proposes and would authorize an additional $10 billion of 48 Cap C or the manufacturing credit for investments in eligible property. Of the 10 billion, interestingly enough, 5 billion is specifically allocated to projects in coal communities, and successful applicants would ultimately also have an option to take a cash payment in lieu of the credit. Very similar to my first comment.
So how about that third one? The third one.
Yeah, the third one is interesting from a legislative perspective, is that we saw within what was called the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which actually came underneath President Bush's administration, so a number of administrations ago, we saw provisions there that dealt with non-business energy property, the construction of energy efficiency homes, and then the provisions around energy efficient commercial building. So there's really three proposals. So we'll start with the non-business, is that the proposal actually extends an existing credit called 25 Cap C for 5 years, and ultimately increases the lifetime limit when we think about non-business energy property, i.e. that appliance comment I made, through January 1 of 2027. So it actually increases the rate by about 15%. When you think about the construction of new energy efficient homes, there was a provision in EPAC that's been extended, which is referred to as 45L, or the tax credit for energy efficient home. And it extends that through December 31, 2026. And it also modifies a number of the definitions around dwelling units and eligible for the credit, and some of the energy provisions underneath ResNet and the IECC standards. And perhaps the one that was more interesting as the proposals, and I would say of these three, I think all will see some form of legislation, but the energy efficient commercial building, what's often referred to as 179 Cap D, which has been an energy efficiency deduction, which is currently at $1.80 a gross square foot, which was made permanent within basically the 2000 late 20 provisions to be permanent, is now going to also be expanded from $1.80 to $3 a square foot for property placed in service. So
that's a big deal.
That is
that's a big building right there.
Moves from 60 cents a square foot to $1. And candidly, it's also looking at what either the ResNet or the IECC standard under the 2018 standard. So there's clear clearly that they want this. And then there's a hidden provision in there, which is interesting. It's called the mechanical insulation labor cost, which would create a new general business tax credit for qualifying mechanical insulation labor cost. So you could actually claim a credit for obviously making your existing building credit be up to 10% of the mechanical insulation labor cost. That is something that's very new. But when you think about the prioritization of energy or clean energy, 13 provisions, those are the big three. And I would remind, you can take cash in lieu of the credit.
Right. So thank you. I mean, that's an excellent overview. Just three of the provisions. I just took a quick peek at the actual Green Book document. As far sweeping as all this stuff is in the Green Book, the energy provisions are roughly 25% of it. So it's just to put it in some perspective of how much is devoted to this topic of energy. And all right.
And I'll say one more that caught my attention was allowing credits for electric vehicles for medium and heavy duty vehicles. I think with the growth, we've seen it with the electric buses, with the trucking and the rest, as they grow those batteries and the capacity to run plug-in vehicles of a larger and more heavy duty size. This credit is out there to encourage and incent that activity too.
That's an excellent point, Sarah, because another credit that's in there that I didn't select out of the 13 talks about expanding the tax credit for electrical vehicle charging stations. And we know that's part of the infrastructure bill. So to your point, Brooks, 25+% of the Green Book is all energy oriented.
All right. So I think we've about wrapped up here, but we can't depart without talking about the R&D credit, which is kind of the granddaddy of all tax credits. And there's been all this talk, research R&D is just a theme that runs throughout all these plans and proposals one way or another. So Ron, give us your crystal ball on the R&D tax credit.
So as a reminder to our audience, the research and development credit been in the Internal Revenue Code since 1981. Was made permanent. It's a significant federal subsidy for the creation of new and innovative, technologies and business components. Within the Tax Cuts Jobs Act of 2017, there was actually a provision which indicated that for tax purposes, you would need to begin to capitalize and in turn amortize your R&D cost. Since 1981, you have been able to expense all those costs. So this is a critical provision that must be addressed for our country. President Biden has identified it. Speaker Pelosi has identified it. Senator Schumer, as well as Senator McConnell and Representative McCarthy. So this is often referred to as 174, which is the provision that talks to us about what are referred to as qualified research expenses. And it is a critical item that will be addressed. I think my crystal ball tells us that provision that came under the Tax Cuts Jobs Act to begin to capitalize effective January 1 of 22 will be repealed.
And that indeed would be great news. All righty. Thank you so much, Ron, for all your insights today. Sarah, you got any wrap-up comments for us?
All good.
All right. So I guess my big takeaway is, we still have moving targets here. I think we've got a lot more clarity on at least what the president and the White House, what they really want. It's game on to see how much they're going to get out of it. All right. So that concludes a quick disclaimer that we are not providing personal tax advice on this podcast. Please consult with your personal tax advisor, hopefully at Cherry Bekaert, with your specific tax issues. Check out our firm's website at cbh.com for the latest guidance and materials on this and other tax and business topics. I would just put a plug in. We have Green Book Podcast Part 1 that talks about the corporate and individual rates of the Green Book, and we had earlier podcasts on the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. So that concludes today's podcast. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, our listeners, for spending your time with us. We truly appreciate it. Let's call it a day. Go forth in peace.